Hello, thank you for joining this evening. I'm going to bring a Scottish perspective to this discussion. And I have to say that I've been in Scotland for so long, well, so long since I've been to England. And the systems and approaches, I guess, are differing and changing dramatically, particularly around land use support between the two countries. So some of what I say will not be relevant to folk in other parts of the UK. So I'm Gordon Gray Stevens. I'm a member of the Native Woods Co-op. I also am a member of the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforest, and part of the work that I do is for the Alliance. So I do a couple of days a month on ad hoc strategization and help for the Alliance as required, essentially. Other than that, most of my work now does involve rainforest restoration on the west coast of Scotland. So today I'm going to talk about the development of rainforest restoration in Scotland, the scale and nature of Scotland's rainforest, the main threats that the rainforest faces, something on the culture of land use in Scotland, something on the principles of rainforest restoration, and finally I'll talk to you about a work in progress at Glen Creran in North Argyll, where rainforest restoration has started. I think I've got about half an hour, if I remember correctly, to talk to you. So I shall try to stick to that, but I'm going to rattle through some slides, basically. So at least you'll have some pictures to look at, even if you don't appreciate what I'm saying. So, developing rainforest restoration in Scotland. This has taken some time. I've been at what we used to call native woodland restoration since the 1990s. What was called native woodland restoration was a bit of an uphill struggle, quite honestly, but I stuck at it and we did a few things in native woodland restoration. Over time, the idea of native woodland restoration morphed into something a bit bigger, I guess. And European funding was a big part of this, the LIFE programme, starting to look at, in this commission report, look at work in the Sunat Oak Woodland Special Area of Conservation. So starting to become a kind of landscape scale project, starting to look at rainforest on a large scale, which is something that will be a theme for my talk today. More European work, restoration of Atlantic oak woods. So they're no longer native woodlands, they're Atlantic oak woods. This was in about 2007, if I remember correctly. They started moving into that. And then Atlantic woodlands again, Plant Life got involved and started producing some really nice guides as to the particularly important lower plants, the lichens and the bryophytes that make Scotland's west coast woodlands so special, the things that make them rainforest, basically. There we go. So that's where I was, talking about Atlantic hazel. So this is one of the particular specialisms. And I guess also from my limited experience, one of the big differences between Cumbria and the west coast of Scotland. My experience of Cumbria, which has been 3 or 4 visits, I visited in 1993 to begin with, and I've been to see Cumbria woodlands a couple of times since, but not probably for 15 years. There was a far more active coppicing scene in Cumbria than there ever was in the west of Scotland. So there was still a live coppicing tradition in 1993. In Scotland, we didn't have that live coppicing tradition. These woods, this is a picture of a wood at Ballahurn, hadn't been coppiced as far as we can tell at all. So the assumption is that on the west coast of Scotland that people were taking individual stems from hazel, because we know they used hazel in some considerable quantity for all sorts of things. But the lower plants, the lichens and the bryophytes, survived in a way that they haven't in other parts of Britain. And the assumption is that that is around the management of the woodlands, that management in Scotland was, in the hazelwoods at least, was less intense than it was in England. Um, moving through development of the rainforest in Scotland, it became Scotland's Celtic rainforest in about 2015 or thereby, and then gradually morphed into the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforests. And this is around branding. And I've been a conservationist. I call myself a tree hugger quite happily. I've been a conservationist for a long time. I was rather suspicious of branding, but actually the rainforest brand is very powerful. And it has allowed things to happen on a scale and at a speed that I hadn't been able to make things happen in the previous 30 years. So people understand what rainforest is. We were told at school, after we'd learnt to save the giant panda, the next thing we learned about was saving the rainforest. So it works across a whole spectrum. If you tell people that Scotland has a rainforest, their immediate question is, wow, how do we save it? And that puts you in a far different place than when you're talking to people about managing their native woodlands, because they don't know what a native woodland is, whereas they know what they don't know much about rainforests, but they know that they're meant to save the rainforest. So if a funder or a politician is asking you, how do we save Scotland's rainforest, you're in a far stronger position than when you're going, please sir, can I talk to you about native woodlands? And they don't know what native woodlands are, and they're not that interested. Because they have a lot of other things to worry about. So anyway, the Alliance has come together. It's a grouping of 24 odd organisations, Scottish and British organisations, but it includes an incredible variety from Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, via the Scottish Lands and Estates, the equivalent of the Country Landowners Association in Scotland, National Trust for Scotland, Woodland Trust, Plant Life, Reforesting Scotland, and Trees for Life, who are quite at different ends of the spectrum normally from where Scottish Lands and Estates sits. So it's brought together a lot of people to work together to restore Scotland's rainforest. And that's a strength. It's the people who make the difference as much as anything. There's a wider network of other people, partners with whom we're working, but they're not necessarily formal members of the Alliance, but part of a wider network who come together to help on various items and aspects of rainforest restoration. One thing we've been very good at is trying to pull together information to help inform what we're talking about. Pretty pictures make a big difference, and these are 3 of the documents that have been produced in the last 5 years to help to inform us. So the first off was the state of Scotland's rainforest, which allowed us to describe and lay out the threats, and then 2 documents dealing specifically with aspects of the main threats faced by the rainforest in Scotland, whether that's deer or invasive rhododendron. The Alliance has also been great at using media in all sorts and shapes and sizes. So whether it's at COP, when COP was in Glasgow, we invited Amazon leaders out from the city centre to come out into Scotland's rainforest and meet the rainforest inhabitants on the west coast of Scotland, and to breathe a bit easier than they probably had done in the previous week in the Glasgow Conference Centre. In Scotland, we get opportunities to talk to politicians, and politicians really get the idea of the rainforest. So government has been a strong supporter. This is Miss Gudgeon in the Scottish Parliament before Christmas, along with 2 other MSPs and 3 of us rainforest types, hosting a reception in the Scottish Parliament to celebrate the rainforest. So really important to have politicians on side, and that's something we've managed to do quite successfully. Also interested in doing all sorts of other weird and wonderful things to raise publicity and to raise money to restore rainforests. So RSPB getting together with Beer 52 to help out and to raise money to restore the rainforest in Morven. Some things make the news more than others, and this is a story from last autumn. Our media specialist tells us that this story about the zombie fungus in Cowell reached had global reach. It was one of the top 3 stories in America the following weekend on social media. So there are tens of millions of people who read about this story. And this was about people going out into the rainforest, volunteers doing citizen science and finding different and very unusual species within Scotland's rainforest, which then caught the attention of the world media and social media. We've also been good at getting Scottish government to recognise the importance of the rainforest and to come up with documents, working with the Alliance to come up with documents which form the Scottish government's approach to restoring and expanding the Scotland's rainforest. So Scottish Forestry, the equivalent of Forestry Commission in England, put one of their senior staff on this for a year. A conservator was seconded to write this document. And that said more or less what we wanted it to say, which was great. So it started on this idea of having priority areas. So these are the bits that the government is most likely to support work on to begin with. And you'll find that in all these red dots, there are things happening. This is actually a clearer map. I'm going to talk about Glen Creran later, and this one maybe shows a little bit more clearly where in the world Glen Creran is. So you might want to pay attention to that. Also managing to get this into the Scottish Biodiversity Delivery Plan, and it tells us one of the approaches that we're taking to rainforest restoration in Scotland, and that is looking at ecosystem restoration, so moving to restoration at scale. We put in a bid to Scottish Government for a rainforest restoration fund, dedicated funding for rainforest restoration. A big number. We think it's going to cost £500 million to restore Scotland's rainforest. That sounds like a lot of money. I'll get to some of the nitty-gritty of where that might come from in the course of time, but I think we need to recognise, if we're going to work in conservation, that sometimes we have to ask for big money. We're rather good at going to government and asking for a few pennies, please. But actually, if you're brave and you ask for a big pot, sometimes you get more attention that way than otherwise. But I think it's also important to say that we're not just looking at ecosystem restoration. This is about more than nature restoration. And it's one of the reasons I think it's landed so well with Scottish Government, because they're not used to environmental NGOs talking about things other than nature. So we can think that we can use rainforest restoration to deliver social benefits and economic benefits to fragile rural communities on the west coast of Scotland. And that's been an important part of our appeal from a funding perspective, I think. So if we move on to the scale and nature of Scotland's rainforest, I would say it's probably bigger than what it is. Scotland is the home to the best remnants of rainforest in Britain, probably in Europe. So this temperate rainforest we have stretches over landscapes. And that makes it important to deal with things at a landscape scale. This is Craignish, one of the priority areas for Scottish Government. Fortunately, a rather well-managed bit of rainforest, but it gives you some idea of the species habitat mosaic that we get on the west coast of Scotland. So a mixture of woodland, native woodland, rainforest, and open space, open habitats. And that mosaic of species is something you get on the west coast of Scotland and gives ecotones. The edges between different habitats, between open land and woodland, are really important for biodiversity, and they tend to be where you get the most species.
Sorry, Gordon, can I just ask a question, please, about the definition of temperate rainforest? Is that like, as in a normal rainforest that is over 100 inches a year, please?
Yeah, it's 1.5 meters. I'll actually come on. There's a slide that deals with that in a second or two. So right. I'll get to that. Don't worry. I'm quite happy to take interruptions as long as I get a bit of extra time as a result.
Sorry. Thanks.
So there you go. Your timing was perfect. So this is a map that Ben Averis came up, and it's based on climatic oceanicity, basically. So the one on the left shows the world distribution of coastal temperate rainforest. It's very limited. It's far rarer than tropical rainforest, for example. Basically, what you need for temperate rainforest is a lot of rainfall. The clue is in the rainforest word, and 1.5 meters is the definition that Ben used to come up with this index. The other things that you need are clean air. So the west coast of Scotland is the prevailing winds come from the Atlantic, from the southwest. So there is clean air in this part of the world, and that is really important for preserving the lichens and the bryophytes, which are very sensitive to industrial pollution. And the other thing that you need is relatively undisturbed or relatively low light touch management, basically. So if you clear fell all your woodland, then you have less good temperate rainforests left as a result. It covers about 20% of Scotland's area. I've got something glitchy going on with this slideshow, I'm afraid. Yeah, I've skipped through a few things here. So you might ask why rainforest is important in Scotland. And some of it is around international significance. So on the left here, I have a species, a lichen called Fissurina alboscripta. And on the other side of the slide, the red dots represent the entire known world population of Fissurina alboscripta. It's only found on hazel woods in Scotland's rainforest. It is rarer by a factor of several tens than the giant panda, for example. But we've all heard of the giant panda. We haven't heard of Fissurina alboscripta. But under the biodiversity treaties that Britain and most of the rest of the world signed up to in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, the deal was that every country was meant to hunt out what was special, what was endemic, only found in their country, and to take special care of those things that were endemic. So if you live in Africa and you're a farmer, you get to cope with elephants, lions, giraffes coming through your farm and disturbing your life. Whereas if you get to live in Scotland or Britain, you get Fissurina alboscripta to look after. We still don't know we all know what an elephant looks like, but very few of us know what Fissurina alboscripta looks like. So I'm just going to show you a couple more pictures of the sort of diversity that you get within our rainforest. This is lungwort, which one of the times I visited the Lake District, I saw a National Trust ranger who was trying to staple lungwort back onto a tree because it had fallen off in a gale. In Scotland, it's so common it's not even regarded as a rainforest indicator. We're more interested in species like this, Pseudocyphalaria novegica, which is a rainforest specialist. It's Norwegian speckled belly is its common name, but it is far more common in the west coast of Scotland than it is in Norway. Blue fungus is one that I rather like. This you find in hazel. This branch of hazel is trapped by a fungus onto a hazel tree. Basically, on the ground layer of a decent bit of temperate rainforest, there are a lot of fungi waiting around looking for some dead wood to eat. The glue fungus has got itself a competitive advantage by gluing, forming bonds between the dead wood and the living wood. It keeps the dead wood off the woodland floor and thus gains a temporary advantage and gets to eat the wood before everyone else does. I find that a rather fascinating species. Moving through, I'm going to talk, because you can't avoid it when you're talking about what's special about a place. You can't avoid looking back into history. And I'm going to start with herbivory. So wild animals have been a component of rainforest since after the last ice age, as have humans for that matter. This is a set of antlers that belong to what was an elk, an Irish elk. They ran at an antler span of 4.5 meters. So the woodlands that result from that are open in character. You don't move around in a dense woodland with a set of horns like that, of antlers like that. And that speaks to the sort of habitat mosaic that I showed you earlier. I think equally, humans were a really important part of rainforest from a very early stage. And I'll illustrate this with this brief description of hazelnut as food. It's very high protein, very dense food, easily gathered, easily stored as well through the winter during the hungry months if you're a hunter-gatherer. This is a pit found on the Isle of Colonsay off the west coast of Scotland. It's about 1.5 meters wide, and the archaeologists identified it as a processing plant for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to roast hazelnuts to keep them so that they would keep better through the winter. And the scale of this is quite mind-blowing. So in 1 year, because they think it was only used in 1 year, there were up to 500,000 hazelnuts put through that pit. So hazel we can regard as being a very important part of the food source for a population in the west coast of Scotland, which is estimated to have been probably less than 1,000 people. So that must have kept the guys going all winter, I reckon. There's a Viking longship, which might seem a bit irrelevant, but it tells us a little bit about the timber resource when the Vikings turned up on the west coast of Scotland. They were building 100-foot long, 30-meter long longships using oak planks, cleft oak planks, because they didn't have sawmilling technology. If you're going to cleave oak planks, you need to have furniture-grade timber, long, straight oak trees to allow you to create the planks that you need to make a waterproof boat. And one of the reasons that historians tell us that the Vikings may have arrived in Scotland is because they'd run out of that kind of oak back in Scandinavia. So that tells us something about the history of the woodland resource that was available on the west coast of Scotland. Moving forward a millennia, the best part of a millennia, and Cumbria meets the west coast. So this is a picture of the charcoal store at Bonor that was set up in the late 1700s by what were described as Cumbrian ironmasters. So in the Lake District, you already had an iron smelting tradition. In Scotland, it had not been industrialized until the 1790s. And the people who did that came from Cumbria. So they arrived in Scotland and set up 2 fairly substantial industrial processing units. Again, the difference between Scotland and England is that these units didn't last for very long. The one at Bonor did carry on until the 1870s, but the one in Furness, the other one in Argyll that was substantial, was closed by 1810. So that was a relatively short period of industrial utilization. They were mostly replaced by sheep. So the west coast of Scotland moved in during what is termed the Highland clearances, and the introduction of sheep into the west coast of Scotland resulted in considerable damage to woodlands. The Ettrick shepherd, moving through Loch Lomond side in the 1830s, described it as a perfect landscape for sheep, with just enough trees left to provide a bit of shelter. Sheep were quickly replaced by deer, another herbivore, numbers to allow Victorian gentlemen to get on trains and come to Scotland and shoot these things during the season. Of course, they were after the ones with horns, with antlers. Finally, in the 20th century, in Argyll, we suffered a considerable quantity of what they called improvement, removing or replacing oak woods, our rainforest, with conifer plantations to help Britain build a strategic timber resource. This is an example in Glen Creran from the 1990s. And if you look at the oak tree on the left, you can see a scar around the bottom of the tree. And that's where it was ring-barked before they planted the Sitka spruce around it. So the tree was killed and left standing in the woodland. 30% of Argyll's rainforest was treated like this between 1945 and 1985. Moving on to rainforest threats. This is a view of Craignish. We have evidence for this. There was a native woodland survey completed in 10 years ago now, which helped to inform what we know about the threats. Some of this is around herbivores. We know that 75% of Scotland's rainforest is adversely affected by too many mouths, and mostly it is deer, although sheep still comprise about 20% of that impact. We can see it in this picture here, down the center of in the foreground here. This is an area that was felled in the Second World War by Canadian lumberjacks and remained within a farming unit afterwards. And there's now a strip, you can see the straight lines of birch inserted into a more complex woodland type because the deer and the sheep ate out the more palatable species. And if you don't have the more palatable species, then you don't get the same range of lichens and bryophytes that you will get on ash, hazel, and oak, for example. The other big threat is invasive non-native species, particularly invasive rhododendron, seen flowering here. Sometimes growing on cliffs overlooking trunk roads. That's an expensive job if you want to get rid of that rhododendron. We know about the scale of the problem for rhododendron. Around 130,000 hectares on the west coast within the rainforest zone that we need to either clear rhododendron or survey and then clear rhododendron. Rhododendron's impact, it's a light thief. So it outcompetes other vegetation, including these internationally rare plants, complicates land management, it simplifies and degrades the environment, and is a major cause for our designated woodlands on the west coast of Scotland being in unfavourable condition. Sitka spruce is increasingly regarded, it's not a proper invasive non-native species because it has economic use, but this picture here shows the impact that we're seeing from Sitka spruce on the rainforest. On the left bottom corner of the picture, there is a Sitka spruce plantation. On the other side, you see Sitka spruce spreading into the rainforest. It's doing very well in Scotland. 47% of the trees in Scotland are Sitka spruce, so there are plenty of seed sources. Moving on to other inns, this is an illustration of what has happened to Japanese knotweed, and I think it shows what we're likely to be subject to from an increasing number of species as we import more and more delightful plants into our gardens. So Japanese knotweed took a very long time to get going, but once it did, it took off quite dramatically. And I think we'll see that basically invasive species seem to take a bit of time to work out how to get going, and then their growth is more or less exponential. These things will have an increasing impact on the future of our countryside. And that increasing impact, the longer we leave it, the more it's going to cost, basically. So Colin Edwards, Forest Research, reckoned in 2008 that the cost of treating invasive rhododendron would double in every 20 years. If I move on to I said I was going to talk a little bit about the culture of land management in Scotland. This is a classic picture. I'm sure you can all spot the conservationists on the front on the left-hand side there, standing beside the headkeeper, who isn't looking very happy either. Behind them, you have the factor and the underkeeper. And we're trying to have a discussion about the future of a bit of woodland, but we're not getting very far, as you can see. So there's a lot of vested interest in land use in Scotland. The sheep and forestry sector in Argyll, in the rainforest zone attracts about 45 million pounds of public subsidy a year. And basically that produces sheep, lamb, that mostly we don't eat, that gets exported. Lamb is in crisis though, or has been. So the amount of lamb eaten per head in Scotland has halved over the last 20 years. So we're eating far less of it, but we're not showing the land managers a different approach to land use that might secure their future as more and more of us turn into vegetarians in response to the threat of climate change. Moving on to the principles of rainforest management. A lot of it has to be done at scale. So this is a thermal image showing 6 red hinds in a field. There's a fence here on the top right-hand side of the screen, and on the right of that there is some rainforest. And it's the boundary between two properties. These deer will move very freely between properties, and unless there is agreement as to how the deer are going to be managed, you will never get to the point at which you can get your rainforest to regenerate. One of the things ASR has done is to try and overcome some of these cultural barriers by bringing together upland deer managers, conservationists, community organisations to try to find the common ground, see what we might agree on about the future of deer management in the rainforest and in the wider Scottish uplands. Rhododendron is another problem that has to be dealt with on a landscape scale. So this is not rainforest. This is a conifer plantation in Appin, but you can see that from this drone shot that there is rhododendron through this conifer plantation. If, whilst we're removing the rhododendron from the rainforest next door, we don't do anything about the invasive plant in the conifer plantation, it will soon return, and we will be forever weeding out the rhododendron from the rainforest. So the basic principle is that you deal with the rhododendron at a population level and get rid of all of it to secure the future of a natural habitat. That can be difficult. Not only do you have to convince people who own conifer plantations who might not be that interested, but you also have to convince householders. So this is beside the A82 trunk road on the way to Fort William. The house there is screened from the trunk road by some invasive rhododendron. That leads to difficult conversations, but there are conversations that must be had if we're going to deal with rhododendron effectively. So we have to work collaboratively and we have to work at scale. Here you can see road corridors are great for moving rhododendron. This is again down a trunk road with rhododendron spreading along the roadside. Timescales are important. We need to have funding over a sustained period of time. It takes at least a decade to get invasive rhododendron to that maintenance phase, at the point where you just need to keep an eye on it. The other thing that is happening on the rainforest, though, is a population change, particularly on the west coast of Scotland. So in the rainforest, Argyll and Bute, where I live, population has declined by 0.63% in 1 year. So there's a dramatic change in the population going on still in Scotland, some parts of the west of Scotland. The other thing that is happening is the population is aging and declining. So left-hand side there shows the population, the child population in 20 years, decreasing by 60% in some parts of the rainforest. The working age population decreasing by 20%, and the population of pensioners increasing by over 150% in that 20-year period. That's a real crisis in 3 graphs. And as I said earlier, we believe that rainforests can provide some of the answer to the restoration of both communities and natural environment. So woodland crofts are one thing we're looking at, ways of getting people to live and work in the rainforest. So if you're a crofter, part of your income is going to be generated off the croft. You may grow some of your own food or process some of your own timber, but that puts you in a perfect place to do some rainforest restoration. We have, as I said, tried to get money from the Scottish Government on a large scale at the £500 million level, and we're still pushing to get that funding. Hasn't happened yet, though. So Rainforest Action, this is moving on to what's happening in Appin in Glen Creran. This is the entrance to Glen Creran with a big area of special area of conservation, oak woodland and ash woodland on the left-hand side there. Phase 1 was in Glen Creran itself, working together. It involved, again, a lot of people coming together, agencies, local community organisations, working together to get something done. There we go. There's the launch in the Glen, featuring a lot of householders and a couple of the funders. Where is Glen Creran? I showed you that earlier, just to the north of Oban. The project here itself, 1,500 hectares. The red dots are the areas we were trying to clear rhododendron from. And the green striped area is special area of conservation. The red areas totaled about 27 hectares within that 1,500 hectares, but that's 27 different owners that we had to talk to and convince, including people in houses like this. So this, again, picture taken from the public road. That was the before, and that's the after. That's what you're asking people to do. Suddenly, I can look in through his kitchen window. I can look into their yard and see into their garden and see what's happening. So you have to talk to people and convince them to do that. Sometimes that can be about firewood. So here's a way of dealing with it. This was rhododendron cleared, and the rhododendron was left for the householder to collect and move to their firewood shed. Rhododendron makes great firewood, so they were very happy with that. To get the money together for this, rhododendron control is regarded as taking things away. So funders like to pay to put things back, basically, to create things. So we did look at adding value. We looked at education and engagement, at green jobs, and the legacy that the project would leave behind as a means of engaging funders with the project. We finally got the money together after 5 years of survey work, engagement, getting everyone in that glen to sign up to remove the rhododendron. It included school projects, so making sure that the next generation knows the importance of the rainforest on their doorstep and also can work together, and also training local people. So how can we leave awareness of how to manage rainforest behind? And the Community Council have taken long-term ownership of the project as the funders move away. This is a shot from one of those training days, teaching householders how to deal with follow-up rhododendron without using chemicals. The Welsh people might recognise this, but we have tried to increase the amount of stem injection that we use to control rhododendron. It minimises the use of herbicide, it's cheaper, and it's more effective than other techniques. However, some of the rhododendron we were dealing with is on cliffs, so we had to deal with specialist contractors. Rhododendrons on cliff is an extremely expensive business. The project was so successful, the community moved wider. And here's a picture of Castle Stalker, which was, you might know from the Monty Python film. They wanted to grow the project, taking the same values forward. So we've been able to do that. And this year we've been surveying using thermal drones to hunt out deer, and also for looking at invasives, but also using more traditional techniques of on-the-ground monitoring and survey work. This is from a heli count to show the deer numbers in Appin. So that's from a helicopter, but on foot, we can see that the herbivore impact assessment shows that 95% of the plots taken were in the red, basically. So far too many deer for the health of the rainforest. It's allowed us to pull together maps of where the invasive species are in the rainforest, and we've broadened it out from rhododendron to include skunk cabbage, Japanese knotweed, as well as self-sown beech and conifer. So it gives an idea of the scale, and it's where you start to get to £1 million+ project, which is where we are with this at the moment. We're now looking at the fundraising to try and deliver the next phase. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll look forward to answering questions on the panel. Thank you.